Alan, I've been trained in science, but I've had a long interest in biblical religions. I was brought up in Jewish tradition. I've studied the New Testament at times, and I've come to rely on philosophy to understand stuff, philosophy of science and cosmology and philosophy of mind and religion. What I'm trying to do is to think through an approach to the Bible. And is it possible to take the methodology of philosophy as we analyze fields like philosophy of science, philosophy of mind, those kinds of things, where we ask the key fundamental questions and apply it to the Bible? So if I asked you to do somebody trained in philosophy and a theologian, if you apply the principles of philosophy of a field to the Bible, how would you begin to structure it?
Okay, interesting question. Now, remember, philosophy of science is a subject.
Yes.
Okay, or we talk about philosophy of art. Art, they're human activities.
Yep.
And the Bible's a book.
Yes.
Okay, so one trivial level, one might say that certainly we should engage as philosophers with the questions thrown up by the study of the Bible or the interpretation of the Bible and all those kinds of forms of scientific human activity.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
So there's direct parallels between philosophy of science and philosophy of the science of the Bible.
You're right.
Different forms of study of the Bible.
So what are those? So just to drill down on that one concept, what are the different scientific approaches, scientific in quotes, approaches to the Bible in terms of biblical criticism, biblical exegesis? I mean, what?
Just basically the hermeneutical traditions, the traditions that are concerned with the interpretation of texts.
Okay.
And so take the interpretation of the wisdom literature. Okay, that requires a series of considerations that are very different from the interpretation of Genesis, perhaps, or the Synoptics, or Revelation. So there are a lot of issues about how we interpret certain texts, and there are philosophical problems, questions built into those. And regularly, I can give you clear examples of this. When biblical interpretation has gone seriously wrong, it's been for philosophical reasons. So I think one example would be, I think there are profound weaknesses in Rudolf Bultmann's exposition of the New Testament and of Paul. And I think they're indicative of the problems that characterized Marburg Neo-Kantianism around the 1900s, where Bultmann studied, and where we had the Marburg Journal. Korn and Natorp and others believed that every faculty in the entire university should be committed to Neo-Kantianism. So that Neo-Kantian philosophy molded Rudolf Bultmann's whole interpretation and appropriation of the New Testament
Which
text.
was what?
So Rudolf Bultmann was committed to demythologizing, as he put it, the New Testament text, because he assumed, on Neo-Kantian grounds, that the universe was a closed causal continuum, and it was not possible for God to be involved in any way in human history. So that had an enormous impact on the way he interpreted what's going on in the New Testament. But to get back to your question, what about, there are other forms of interpretation of the biblical text. For example, there's archaeological forms of interpretation. And that probably wouldn't raise quite so many philosophical interpretations. When people are digging away to try and find evidence of early Christian or Jewish communities or whatever, probably not quite so many philosophical questions.
There are differences in archaeology. The so-called biblical minimalists who would believe that much of the Old Testament was not historical or was created many, many centuries later in some sort of a retrospective kind of mythological context, and people who believe that there are more indications of biblical characters. I mean, that's an open issue in the interpretation of how archaeology goes. So we have this one big section, which is interpreting the Bible, whether through exegesis or whether through archaeology or whatever. So what are some other big categories that, as with a philosopher's hat, can you look at the Bible and try to apprehend?
Okay. Well, there's the other fundamentally important task, which is simply assessing biblical claims. myriad claims about the nature of God and so on.
For sure.
All of which raise philosophical questions and questions about their cogency, their implications, and the coherence between different claims that are made.
What's an example of an adjudication of different claims?
Okay. Well, for example, some philosophers would say that to take seriously the statement that God is one commits us to simplicity. Okay? And others will say, how can we affirm divine simplicity and say that God is Father and Creator and Redeemer and so on and so forth? So that would be one kind of example. Another kind of example is how we understand worship in the Bible. And that's actually particularly relevant because, again, we would tend to assume, not just in philosophy, but in the social sciences, that we have a preconceived conception of what worship is. Worship is human beings trying to reach the transcendent or adore the transcendent in some way. Now, if you're looking philosophically at the kinds of claims that are made about worship in the New Testament, we discover that actually it just doesn't fit that preconception. Worship is not, in the first instance, something that we do. Worship is about what God does. God, it's the gift of participating by God's grace in the divine communion mediated through Christ. And so there's one true worshipper, namely Jesus Christ, who is, of course, the incarnate Son. So in other words, there's an example where philosophers can come with a concept of worship and say, okay, what are the biblical conceptions, what's the biblical interpretation of worship? And suddenly find themselves having to recognize and to think through the implications of the fact that the biblical interpretation of worship is very different from models of religious worship you find in other religious traditions.
Okay, so that's another category of worship. What other ways of understanding the Bible could there be? Big categories.
And okay, the nature of what it is to be a human person, and how we think about soul and body. Okay, and that's a very lively, ongoing debate amongst Christian philosophers.
So as a philosopher, what's your overall sense of just looking at the Bible? If I can just ask you that, from your philosophical training, and you look at the Bible, what do you say?
I see it as a very diverse human witness to God's self-disclosure. And it's self-disclosure in different ways, but culminating in the once and for all, as the New Testament writers put it, incarnation of the Son in Jesus Christ. Okay, so it's a witness. I don't think that the Bible didn't drop from the sky. It's not to be seen as an extensive series of self-contained propositional truths, right? It's a radically human witness to which we have to interpret.